Well, good morning from a slightly rainy London and also from a rainy Surrey. And we're here today to talk about insuring the ethereal, closing the gap between tangible and intangible asset risk transfer. And I'm delighted to have with us our guest today, Dr. Trevor Maynard, who's the head of innovation at Lloyds of London. So welcome, Trevor. Now, you'll know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I am one of the directors of Zien. And it really is a privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars. And I can only do so thanks to the generosity and tolerance of our sponsors. And I must say tolerance because they let us range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And I think the tolerance was shown definitely on today's title, Insuring the Ethereal. What were we talking about? Insuring the heavens? No, it's much more important than you could actually possibly dream. And we have a couple of poll questions today, which I think will emphasize that. Anyway, Trevor has very kindly agreed to talk for approximately 20 minutes in the usual format that we have. So we have adequate time for questions and answers where we really need you to participate. I'll be getting out of the way as quickly as I can so you can hear from our expert. But just before I do so, 3 points, if I may. Firstly, yes, the slides are available, and Peter will be putting into the chat room links to some of the reports that Trevor's going to mention, as well as background on the lab. Secondly, the recording will be going up in approximately two working days, so I would assume sometime on midday-ish Wednesday. And finally, on the questions and answers, all of your questions, answers, comments, observations will get sent to Trevor with your email attached, so you can get in touch with him. But if and only if you use the GoToWebinar question and answer facility. So please use that so I can feed that into our conversation with Trevor at the end. No point in WhatsApping me, WeChatting me, signaling me, emailing me, because I'm here with you. So please do use that facility. And with that, I think in no further ado, Trevor, the floor is very much yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to speak. So talking about insuring the ethereal, and this is all about tangible and intangible assets. So on the next slide, I think we can see that we've done a series of reports over the last year and a half, working with our partners, KPMG. Started with protecting intangible assets, which was just a general overview report covering what intangible assets are and raising the key ones. And then we did 3 deep dives. The first one was on intellectual property, so safeguarding intellectual property. The second one on reputation, and the third one on human capital, that very, very important third asset. So before I get into that, I wanted to just talk about a couple of things which I will mention throughout the talk. So on the next slide, you should see the Lloyds Lab. Now, the Lloyds Lab is our incubator and accelerator for insurance innovation, and it was launched in 2018. And it's a great in-person space. So obviously we've missed being there in the last sort of 16 months or so. But nevertheless, we've carried on innovating and we've done several successful programs. And the way it works, we put themes out there. Currently, the themes are climate change and geopolitics and claims, and also data and models. And we get to, different companies applying to be in the lab, and then they go through a competitive process of selection, eventually pitching to the part of the lab. And then the ones that are successful join our 10-week program. And then at the end of it, we hope to have some commercial outcomes. And I'm going to be talking about one particular case in a minute that went through that program on the subject of today's talk. And then the next slide also shows another important aspect to Lloyds and the way we work in innovation. And this is the product innovation facility. And this is 25 managing agents. You can see them named there in the picture. And the way they work is very much like the Titanic slip. And how did Lloyds manage to insure the Titanic? And you can see that lovely slip on the left-hand side, very famous there. And lots of underwriters taking small shares. And the idea of the product innovation facility is similar. It's basically to take small stakes in some of these innovation experiments to try them out. And the idea is to sort of see if they work. If they don't work, you've not lost too much money, you've not spent too much, and you're mutualizing the costs of that as well amongst your amongst your peers. And so again, I'm going to give an example in a minute of, in the context of what we're talking about today, how this group has functioned. But now on to the talk itself, protecting intangible assets. So let's just talk through in the next slide what we mean by this. But before we do, I've got a question which I think Michael can run. What percentage of S&P 500 value is comprised of intangible assets? Over to you, Michael.
Great, Trevor. And I'm just launching that poll now, folks. You can see it in front of you. What percentage of S&P 500 value is comprised of intangible assets? This is the percentage of market capitalization. And as ever, well, even faster than usual, 65% of you voted in 10 seconds. That's impressive. I'm just going to leave it open for a few seconds longer as we get the percentage of people voting up well into the 80s and now 90s. Now closing that poll, Trevor, I'm about to share the results with everyone. And you can see here that there's a bit of mind games going on. Everybody, I think the majority seem to feel it's 39%. So 39%, sorry, I think it's 68%. Over to you, Trevor.
Thank you very much. Yes, a bit confusing having the answers as percentages and the voting numbers as percentages. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. And on the next slide, you can see that actually, in a way, you were all right, and it depends on which part of history you're looking at. So in 1975, it was indeed 17% of the market cap was relating to intangibles. But by the time we get to 2015, we've actually reached 84%. And so that's clearly what it is about that today, possibly even a little bit higher.
That's pretty sneaky, Trevor. You're basically saying that we're all living in 1995, huh?
well, perhaps some of the people think that. But yeah, so incredible to think that 84% of those S&P 500 companies, their market cap relates to intangible assets. And in fact, if you look at the pie charts on the right, you can see that for tangible assets, the grey ones, around about 90% of those are insured. But for intangible assets, only about 5% of that is insured. So we have a huge 95% of 84% gap of the insurance of the market cap of those S&P 500 companies. So it's a very important issue, and that's really why we've been looking at it. So moving on. One of the reasons we think that this is not likely to change either is that the pace of change and the causes of these intangible assets are things like new technologies. So 3D printing, deep learning, robotics, all of these are kind of core to driving the IP and the reputation and the other things that make up those assets. And so that trend is not going away. The speed of change is unlikely to slow down. On the next slide, we can see as well how the change in the top 10 US companies by market cap has changed since even 2008. I mean, 2008, really not that long ago, just the sort of financial crisis time. Many of us will remember that keenly. And you can see there that the top 5 have only one tech company in it. And you've also got energy, industrials, telecoms. By the time we get to 2018, all tech companies are in the top 5. And of course, tech companies in particular have a huge amount of intangible asset value. So moving on. What are intangible assets? And I think everyone on the call probably has a fair view of these, but it's interesting thinking through and structuring them into a sort of a table like this. So we thought of them in terms of 3 ways: structural capital, relational capital, and human capital. And from top to bottom, you're more likely to have it recognized on your balance sheet at the top and much less likely to have it recognized in an accounting sense on the balance sheet at the bottom. And you can see that in things like innovation capital, process capital, organizational capital, they make up what we call structural. And they're things like intellectual property, proprietary software and databases, written processes and procedures, organizational culture and rules and norms even. Relational means the relationships we have. So your reputation, your brand, your relationship with customers, and also distributors and partners. And then the human capital is about that skills and capabilities of your members of staff. And that's an important asset if thought of in that way. So moving on. We thought about this in terms of 2 dimensions. One was, how easy is it to quantify this asset? And the second one is, how important is it? So we've ranged this on the x-axis on the left-hand side from very difficult and then getting relatively easier. All of these are pretty hard, actually, compared to, they're not all traded, and therefore it's quite hard to value some of these things. But then there are some that are particularly hard. And then we've also got the y-axis in terms of asset value, ranging from high, they're all very important, to extremely high. And you can see there that this is our view of where they should live on that graphic. Obviously, interested to hear if you have different views. And you can see there that something like intellectual property, this is something that is somewhat traded, very, very important, been around a long time, and that's on the easier end of quantifying, but also still very, very important. Reputation is getting harder to quantify, but still super important. And then human capital really isn't something that is that well quantified in the literature, and yet is thought of as possibly the most important of these intangible assets. So moving on, we are saying to our customers that there are 5 things you can do. And although some of these things might seem somewhat obvious, actually, we think that they're the sort of things that people don't necessarily do systematically. And it's very important. So firstly is assess the value of intangibles. Have a go at assessing them for your organization. Use some of these techniques to measure them. And then that enables you to rate the relative value of different things. Is it reputation that drives most of your value, or your IP, or is it perhaps the human capital asset? Then you can perform wargaming exercises that test your resilience to the different risks. And our reports have a few scenarios in there that you might like to consider. And then ask yourself, can you adequately monitor intangible asset values? And are there other groups that you should be speaking to? And then finally, if there are things that you can't, you might want to think about risk transfer solutions. So a lot of these things are about managing them yourself, and we accept that. But there are quite a few risk transfer solutions out there, and I think they will grow, and this is an area of innovation. So moving on, this is where we're going to deep dive into the 3 reports. So intellectual property. There are 6 types of intellectual property, and you can see them on the screen there, sort of copyrights, patents, trademarks, trade secrets. The geographical indications one is interesting. This is like something like Evian or Perrier or Champagne, where you have a region that is actually intimately linked to the brand itself. And this can go both ways. If your brand is damaged, it can damage the economy of the region, and vice versa. If something goes on in the region, it can damage your brand, even though it's got nothing to do with you. So that's an interesting one. I thought was quite not something I'd thought of before we started looking at this work. Moving on, you can see there that the growth in IP has been pretty astounding on various measures. So the number of patent applications has gone up 5% per year since '98. Industrial design grants up 7% per year since 2000, and so on and so on. R&D spend a little bit flatter though, which is, I think, interesting. And if we move on to the next slide, which deep dives into the top left graphic there, you can see that same figure. So increases year on year from 98 to 2018, but also look at China, really picking out China as being the one that has the most patent applications, 3 times as many as its nearest rival, the US. And so, a really big split there globally. Moving on. So here's an example, online piracy of your digital product. This might be the sort of thing you do a scenario analysis about. So you've just had a media session where you talk about publishing your content tomorrow and voicing happiness that there are no leaks. An hour later, you learn your content has been leaked and it's been published on all major torrent websites. So what's the value of this going to be? And this happened for real with Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones was watched illegally by I think it was 190 million people, and was only watched legally by 16 million people. So, the ratio from illegal to legal was absolutely vast there. And of course, that would have had a huge impact on the value of that. Next slide, please. So imagine you're a small business, you invent a unique product and you have a successful patent application. You're delighted by this. You start licensing the product to major market players and you think that you've won. And then some major competitors, maybe larger firms, start challenging the validity of your patent. Turns out that they're wrong, but nevertheless, this costs a lot of money in legal proceedings and you run out of money. So the company can be devastated by an IP attack, even though they didn't do anything wrong. And so that's where things like insurance can come in to help. So moving on to the next slide. Are there solutions? Yes, there are. There are defensive products where this would protect the insured against someone making a claim against its patent, or a claim about the insured infringing someone else's patent. So these are sort of defending yourself in some manner. And then there are also offensive products, which is where you would go after a third party that's either knowingly or innocently infringing your IP. And so there are both of those products available. Now let's move on to its reputation. So yeah, safeguarding reputation. So moving on, you can see reputation is interesting because it's not about identity, it's not about who you are, and it's not about your brand, which is who you want to be seen as. That's kind of you put a lot of effort into brand defining what you want to be seen as. Reputation is what others see you as. And this can be broken into two distinct types. You've got capability and character. Capability is basically your ability to do what you say you will do. And this tends to be pretty stable and last a long time. If you're good at it, then you tend to find that that's relatively stable. But if it gets affected, then it can have a massive impact on your business. Character is about how people perceive the way you do things. And this is becoming increasingly important with social media. And this can be volatile and changing very regularly all the time and needs careful monitoring. And you can see there are key stakeholders: customers, employees, business partners, politicians, journalists. There are many different stakeholders where your reputation matters, and it can even vary across those stakeholders. So it's a very complex area. Moving on. Another poll. So over to you, Michael.
That's great. And just launching a poll here to get the brain cells going. Which of the following sectors has the highest percentage of its market cap purely dependent on corporate brand and reputation? Is that financials, healthcare, technology, telecommunications, or consumer goods? And yet again, the audience votes fairly rapidly here. We've just crossed the 50% threshold, the 70% threshold, and the 80% threshold. And I'm just going to leave it open a couple more seconds for those who are pondering. Okay, and well over 90%, and I'm going to shut that and share the results. So we've got basically 25% on financials, 16% in healthcare, 27% technology, 2% telecommunications, and 30% consumer goods. So consumer goods is the highest category there. Back to you, Trevor.
Thank you very much. And on the next slide, you can see actually the answer is technology, with 43% of its market cap relating to reputation, according to this survey. Telecommunications actually very high, healthcare very high, consumer goods very high. And financials is still very, very important. It's above the average, but it's the lowest of that group out of interest. $16.7 trillion of market cap in the market relates to reputation. So what can we do about it, and how can we think about it? Let's move on to the next slide. So basically, managing reputation is follows a sort of cycle. You've got your business as usual, which you hope, of course, goes on as long as possible. I mean, the perfect outcome is that it's business as usual forever. Here, it's all about working to enhance your reputation, monitoring it, using new techniques, in fact, to monitor social media, that sort of thing, reacting to things as quickly as possible, trying to get ahead of it. But then an event might happen. It might be something on social media, it might be some product, it could be all sorts of reasons that cause it. And then it's all about speed of response. You need to try and limit the damage. So with the media, you need to speak to them very quickly. You need to own it. You need to sort of basically explain why it is that this has happened, what you're doing about it, not to try and stand away from the subject, but actually try and take hold of it. And the same is with stakeholders, particularly on social media. In fact, if anything, I'm pondering whether that graph should be the other way around these days. Social media often gets there first before the mainstream media, and there we would want to get on top of that very quickly. And then, of course, financial impacts can flow, and you need to rebuild your reputation afterwards as well. And there's a whole load of work to be done there. And insurance can play a role in all of these phases, actually, as I'll explain. So next slide, please. So here's an example of a reputational risk. A document leaks showing that your organization emits twice as much carbon dioxide than previously reported. This is the top right-hand corner, by the way. The same day, there's a press article quoting your CFO that there's no evidence of climate change. So we have a denier. They're less and less easy to find, thank goodness, but still some out there. And a week later, there's a survey showing your school leavers would hate to work in your organization. So you can sort of see a link through to things like recruitment and all sorts of things. So reputation having a big effect, and often this is why we call it a risk of risks. It can aggregate multiple risks in your country, in your company, up into something that has an effect on your reputation. So next slide, please. So just to show a couple of products, Beazley, we did this work over the course of 2020, and Beazley and others worked with us throughout. And they, at the end of it, launched a new product. It kind of revamped a product they had already on reputational harm. And what they added to this was Polecat, which is a service provider that actually does monitoring of reputation. And so I think this is interesting because it shows you how service provision is being added to insurance contracts more and more as being part of the deal. So it's not just about writing a check. You don't just want to get money out of these situations. You want to know how to deal with them. And in fact, we spoke to some risk managers recently. I spoke to a very large company in the US, and they were saying, you know, the money barely matters to us. It's all about the event response. And so coupling the things up is really important. And Beazley worked with the Product Innovation Facility to get this launched. And then the next example on the next slide is a nice example from the perspective of how innovation at Lloyds works. So a lot of companies, particularly smaller companies, are using cloud services, and that is their product online. So if the cloud fails, then they can't serve their customers, and their reputation could be very seriously affected. So we did several reports actually on cyber risk, looking at cloud failure. And Parametrics read this report and contacted me and said, we think we've got a way of creating an insurance product for this. And I said to them, we'll fill in the Product Innovation Facility form, which is on our landing page. They did so. We sent it to the facility, and they said, this is really interesting. Why don't you get them to apply to Lloyds Lab? So we got them to apply, and they were successful. And they got into the program last year, which was our first virtual program during COVID. And yeah, after the 10 weeks, they had worked with TMK in particular to come up with a policy wording and a product design, and launched a product in September 2020. So, you know, I particularly like that story because it goes from thought leadership through to a product, which is really what we're trying to do in the innovation team at Lloyds. Now onto human capital. So let's move on. Here we can see that human capital is broken down into your competence, so the knowledge, skills, and experience of your employees, the context, so are they happy with the role, what's the environment they're in, are they paid enough, because all of these things will affect their morale, and that has a huge impact on the value of the human capital asset. And then the person itself, so are they engaged, how well are they, how resilient are they, and that affects their health. So these three aspects are key to defining the value of the asset. Moving on. You can see that this is actually the largest value creator. If you remember that slide, it just peaked above reputation. And there are these four types of capital. So implicit and tacit knowledge, capability, skills, health, and attitudes. And we know that both companies and countries spend a huge amount on education and a huge amount on health. So these are highly valued, but they aren't necessarily thought of as an asset in the way that we are thinking about them here. And there's not much insurance for it. So moving on. There are 8 key levers that can be pulled in an organization. Culture and diversity is number 1. Leadership, and this is about how people feel they're being treated. Recruitment and onboarding, and if you get that right, you'll retain. If you get it wrong, people will leave, and that will be value destroying. Learning and development is sort of clear. It's about increasing the value of the skills asset. Performance management and reward is similar. Physical and mental well-being is all about health. CSR and organizational purpose. ties a lot into reputation and how people feel about working in the company. And then exit and alumni management is about when people leave, are they going to be your greatest advocate in their next job? Did they love working for you, or are they leaving with a cloud over them? And that can also affect the value of that asset going forward. So moving on, here's an example. I quite like this example because it really highlights, I think, where the future lies. Your HI analytics fail to notice, top right again, fail to notice a sudden spike in absences of people with a specific skill that's not widely available across your organization. Due to the unavailability of this skill, you cannot meet supply demands and business is interrupted for 2 weeks. So they're highly skilled individuals that become ill. They are all absent. You fail to meet the demands of your customers. That could affect your reputation. So you can see how these intangibles tie in together. But if you'd had better HR analytics, you could maybe have spotted this and done something about it, bought in consultants at the right time or whatever. So moving on, you can see that insurance, there's a lot of insurance actually for certain obvious things. So things like life insurance, private medical insurance, workers' compensation, they're very well established industries. On the other side of things, there's things like key person insurance, kidnap and ransom, directors and officers. So there are products out there, and we think that some of these can be extended. So why not have key team insurance rather than just key person insurance? And then there's things like business interruption and reputation and crisis management and other things like that, which are already on sale. Next slide, please. So let me just summarize. The majority of major company value is now intangible, as we saw, and there is this large insurance gap. Key assets include intellectual property, reputation, human capital, although there are others, and they'll be interesting to explore in future. We're exploring solutions in those areas above, and I mentioned the Lloyds Lab and the Product Innovation Facility as key ways that we're doing that at Lloyds. And we do think that there's many opportunities for innovation, and I'd love to hear of some from you in the questions in a second. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Trevor. Absolutely fascinating running through it, and well thought through and extremely well organized, and we've got lots of questions. I'll start with a couple of quick ones, if I might, just points of clarity. Hugh Purse is just curious, you said 84%. You were talking about the weighted value of the S&P, I assume, not the number of companies, and therefore given that heavy concentration in tech, does that materially affect it if you took those top 5 tech companies out, affect that 84%?
And that's a fantastic question. I mean, I have to disappoint you immediately by not knowing the answer to that, but we can go back and ask KPMG that question. I would imagine it would to some extent, but I don't think it invalidates the conclusion, because if you think about the number of reputation examples you'll have seen in the press and how companies have to react to it, I think it's a fairly safe conclusion, but you are right, it probably does skew it.
And Hugh is also just curious, do you happen to know the equivalent percentage of intangible assets in the Chinese stock market?
No idea at all. Sorry. I suspect there might be a trend for these very detailed questions.
Okay. John Spain, again, point of detail quickly. Is the UK really outside the patents top 20?
According to that graphic, I mean, the thing with this is that we're obviously working with our partners, and they source this information for us, but it would seem that way. And I don't know whether there's been a sort of explosion in China where they really try to patent everything that moves. Maybe there's a different cultural approach to it as well. We might try and do big patents that cover a wide range of things in one go rather than individual things. I don't know. There could be trends like that as well in there. But,
okay. Now, here's an interesting one, because I've always had difficulty as an accountant when we began looking at intangibles years ago, because it's largely based on the idea that we've got stuff on the balance sheet that we can touch and feel, and the market price is completely different. And one can go around in a few circles here. So this comes from Henry Winnan. Intangibles are priced every day continuously in capital markets in that sense. So what is your approach to bridge the gap between products by the year and a continuous pricing in capital markets?
I think one of the interesting things that this brings up is that when I've spoken to the underwriters, they are quite uncomfortable with using some sort of market definition of value, because there are so many other things that can affect those values, and it's very hard to unpick which part of market cap relates to something. For example, COVID would have had a big effect on stock markets, but there might have also been simultaneously for a particular company a reputation event at that moment. How do you unpick which effect is which? And so what the underwriters have said is that what they would much prefer to do is to create products that respond to specific harms. So if you, for example, can, I don't know, think through something like monitoring the internet for a particular form of reputational damage. We did a whole year's project actually with a company called RepTrack. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they break down reputation monitoring into, I think it's 7 or 9 different index values, and they monitor very carefully using a combination of sort of internal questionnaires, monitoring the internet, monitoring the media, external questionnaires, and they can build up a sort of a very clear picture of the reputation of the company, and they can then tell you when it's dropped. And I think underwriters would be much more comfortable triggering a payment from something like that and then having a defined payout than trying to refer to a market index where you just can't tell the extent to which the index is responding to the actual reputation or some other exogenous factor. So in a nutshell, I think the answer is we're not trying to join them up. We're trying to come up with a different way of proxying it and triggering it.
Yeah, Marcus Johnson kind of similar to Henri, and surely if you can assess enterprise value and subtract everything which has an easily quantifiable value, what you're left with is a sum of less easily quantifiable, and the board needs to make a division of this between categories approximate, but the value of intangibles will always be subject to huge errors. So interesting point there.
And on to that point though, I think just to say that it's another example of when you've got insurance, you don't want the insurer having too much information that you don't have. You don't want the company having too much information that we don't have. And that's where I think these sort of proxy approaches are the way to meet in the middle, because the company splitting its own assessment of its own asset would be hard to make that a trigger for insurance. There'd be so much moral hazard in there.
Henri, again, just do you expect cyber risks to fall into this world of intangibles, or is that separate?
I think definitely included, and in fact you've got things like databases and software as listed down there. Proprietary software and databases is at the bottom right there. So definitely does impact. And also, as I said, reputation's a risk of risks. So if you get hit by a cyber attack, that can then affect actually many things. It can affect your reputation, that can affect your morale in your company and your human capital asset. So it doesn't just have its own bucket, it also affects other things.
And now, Bob McDowell's got, I think, a really subtle point here, given some of the examples you had. He wonders, to what extent do companies consider that the risks associated with intangible assets might actually increase having taken a public listing?
I don't know what they think, but I'm guessing that the answer is that they should think that it would increase, because the more public listed you are, the more people can track things more easily, the more information about you there is, and therefore things like reputation in particular. But also it might raise your profile, which might mean that patent trolls and others would go after your IP. So I would say that the answer is yes, it should definitely increase it, and they would think that.
Yeah, interesting. It's all that bit about a lot of this stuff is slightly more interrelated than kind of, if my plant burns down, it burns down, but it doesn't burn my other plants in other countries or something. It's a very interrelated risk here.
Yeah.
An interesting and slightly unusual one. Paul Kitchener, was there scope for insuring against the Trump presidency?
I mean, that's a very interesting question, because we're just looking at geopolitical risk as our next subject, and so whether you can literally insure that particular thing, I don't know, but we certainly look at the market already covers things like contract frustrations and different things like that. So if there were impacts of that sort of thing that led to insurable aspects like contract frustration or those sorts of things, but whether you could actually have the Trump becoming president as a trigger is an interesting one. I mean, from an insurability perspective, I think if you did I'm trying to think live here. It's not very pretty. So I was thinking you'd have to demonstrate an insurable interest in that. Otherwise, is it just gambling? That's always the problem when you try and do these parametric type triggers. You have to ask the question: does the person have an insurable interest? And is it gambling or is it insurance? So you'd have to have a very clear link that you could demonstrate clear damages to your assets that would arise from that cause. And I think if you could make that case, then in theory it could be insurable. But I don't think it was in practice. I don't think it was.
Interesting. Philip Leone, I'm not going to get into the politics here, and the reward is a Biden presidency. Anyway, let's leave that alone for a second. We've had a couple of comments as well. I'm just going to tidy this up, Trevor, and then we'll move on to some other stuff. Edwina Morton was wondering about the Chinese figures for internationally recognized patents. History of lots of patents, but many that would not be recognized elsewhere. And Hugh Purser has dug into some interesting stats from the World Intellectual Property Organization. An estimated 14.9 million patents were enforced worldwide in 2019. The highest numbers were the US, 3.1, China, 2.7, Japan, 2.1. And of the 58.2 million trademark registrations, the greatest number enforced were in China, 25.2 million, followed by the US, 2.8, India. So China accounted for quite a bit of this, but it is Chinese, Edwina, so we're there. Just moving on back onto topic. Naomi Takagoshi, I hear nowadays insurance is more about helping clients prevent incidents from happening instead of paying out insurance. For example, telematics detecting bad driving, health apps helping policy holders have a more healthy lifestyle. Would this be the case for insurance against intangible risks? And if so, how could insurance really be helping, providing consultancy?
That's a great question. So definitely it is. And in fact, the Beazley product for reputation is exactly that. So the Polecat service, as I understand it, is about monitoring reputational causes and then providing companies with that intelligence so that they can react to things before they've escalated into a major, Me Too like movement. So you're absolutely right. And I think it can be all sorts of things. So it can be event response. It can be making sure that we've got access to the best experts, people that have been through this before. So when a company has a reputation hit, for example, or an IP attack, they might simply have never had to defend that before, and they wouldn't necessarily know what to do. So having access to the experts that know exactly what to do in that situation, it could be, it could be a media consultant that tells you what you need to do, which TV programs you need to appear on, what adverts you need to put in what newspapers. And for something like IP, it could be lawyers that know exactly how to defend against, patent trolls and people like that. So yeah, I think a lot of it's about event response, but then as you say, also in advance, trying to stop the event happening at all. And there again, I think there's a role for coupling up. I've always thought, why not also have the insurance part of that? Effectively, your part of the payout is the money needed to then get those people to give their advice. So you're paying for the advice at the time it's needed. And we could either provide those experts, or we could just give you the money to pay your experts that you've already got contracts with.
Bob McDowell is curious about tangible assets and the main having durability beyond a year or something like that. But he's also wondering, he assumes intangible assets, can they be used as financial collateral?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And in fact, one of the things that people ask about for insurance is, will insurers insure a fall in the value of an asset so that it can be used as collateral for a loan? I mean, this is another very tricky area because, as I was saying earlier, there are so many ways the asset could fall. So I think, in a nutshell, I think that it's a difficult area. Some definitely can. So some IP, some forms of IP are recognised, like patents, and definitely can form part of value. Other things like we've got a particularly good human capital asset because our staff love us, probably is pretty hard, and I think will remain quite hard for some time. And I think from an insurance perspective, back to my earlier point, we could insure triggered events, but it's very hard to insure just the value of an asset for all, on an all risks basis. That's pretty tough, actually.
Yeah, I was thinking as you're doing your presentation, you had, for example, that human capital might be hard to quantify. And at first I was like, well, you could price rehiring all those people, but you made a much more subtle point that it's about all those people working together. and that's a much more difficult thing. I was also curious, in terms of kind of getting things wrong, in the poll, and we like to pride ourselves in the FS Club on our insights. We were way off. We had telecoms as 2%, and you said it was 39%. So, any idea what we're missing there? Why is it that intangibles are so strong in telecoms?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if reputation is a big part of it, because the ongoing service of a telecom company is vitally important. People are doing more and more things on their mobile phones. Broadband, you rely on it. If you're a company, you rely on it. So I think that would be a big aspect of that asset. So that's probably one of the major ones. It could also be IP as well, although that wasn't part of that poll. But that would be there are technologies that they have, I would imagine, patents for that are quite valuable.
Richard Despard is curious, beyond your internal resources, do you only work with smaller companies that have useful ideas to the Lloyds Lab? Is there a shortcut for more advanced solutions and situations?
No, great question. No, we definitely don't just work with small companies. We had Experian in the lab in cohort 3. Our actual entry criteria is that you have to have a clear proposal for the 10 weeks. And it needs to not be a massive advert or sales pitch for 10 weeks. It needs to be, here's the problem we think we can solve. It can be a very big company, it could be Microsoft, I wouldn't mind who it was. We think we can solve this tough problem. I mean, maybe it's someone that says, they come along and they say, we can help you manage geopolitical risks using all of our search engine results or something. And they think they can create a product with the product innovation facility. And this is how we think we could do it. We would absolutely welcome that in the lab. So no, it's not. It's just that we also find the small enterprises are very quick to move and have got lots of ideas, and they don't have to go through layers of sign off to try things as well. So they can be a good group to work with, but there's no requirement to.
Well, there are a couple of people here, Harry Hellier and a few others, who want to get in touch with you about working with the lab. But moving on, Con Keating, we know the relationship between tangible assets and productivity well. What is the equivalent for the various classes of intangible? This would be on the basis on which he would make an insure or not to insure decision.
Well, I mean, I think if I've understood the question, I would say the one to look at first would be the human capital asset. I mean, that's all about productivity. So if morale is high, then productivity is often higher. If health and well-being is high, if your senior staff respect you, then it goes up. And so I'd say that there's a huge impact between human capital and productivity. I mean, clearly, if you're spending loads of times defending patents, and that's going to cut the productivity. Your legal team should be spent on doing new innovations in your company and helping you launch new things, not defending the old ones. So that would affect productivity. And then similarly, your comms team, in fact, that's one of the things we wanted to get across to risk owners, is that buying insurance for things like reputation helps you focus on your BAU and getting the things done that you wanted to do, because you've got the other side of it covered. You can respond to these reputation impacts, basically. So yeah, I think they all would tie in very strongly to productivity.
Sophie Newton, I'm going to do 2 quick questions here, and this one is not quick, so do your best. Sophie Newton, further to the question about whether Trump becoming president was an insurable event, and your comment on the need for an insurable interest, what are your views on synthetic insurance and its ability to cover intangible assets? Where do you think the line is between synthetic cover and financial backing or gambling?
Can you define synthetic insurance for me? Is that things like ILSs and stuff like that?
I think so, yes.
I mean, I guess, again, if you can come up with a clearly defined trigger that the financial markets are willing to provide capital for, then as long as it's all about getting advice from the lawyers, to be honest with you. Sorry to give a bad answer, but it's, you have to test your policy wording. You have to check there's an insurable interest and that sort of thing. And then there's no reason why those synthetic covers can't, actually.
Okay. And the very last question, a very good one to end on, Mike Clark. What was the lab's biggest learning from the crystallization of COVID risks?
I'm gonna just say, I mean, it's probably not the biggest, but one of the things I've noticed is that innovation continued, that we were able to keep running the lab virtually, and really, really successfully, with lots of people getting involved and keeping innovating. That parametrics product was created and launched in 10 weeks in the first lockdown. So let's not give up on innovation, even though times are tough.
Well, Trevor, we've, as you know, come to the end of time. Lots of thanks, which will be sent on to you for your absolutely fascinating presentation. Great depth, too, and an eye-opener for many of us, including me. I must say what I really did love was Donald McRae's comment. How would you insure against a footballer moving some drink cans at a press conference? But let's let's not go there. Anyway, if I could, 3 quick rounds of thanks. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to the sponsors. I believe this is really right up our street here, particularly on the economics and the future of finance. And this is where it's happening, folks. Secondly, thanks to you for listening, and you've been very vibrant today. And we could have got on with comments on public-private risk sharing, climate change as ever, and climate tipping points, and you know, some more detail on risk mitigation measures on IP. Lots of questions. I will be sending all of those to Trevor, though. But Trevor, my sincerest thanks has to be clearly to you. Some absolutely fantastic preparation, some somewhat, I wouldn't say counterintuitive, but hidden areas that people just haven't been digging into. And that big number, and the number from just a year ago, which is 84%, that's something I think we should all take away today. But thank you very much. And unfortunately, technologically, we have yet to learn through innovation how to open the floodgates of applause. But I will, in fact, use my Korean karmic clapper as a substitute. And I'd like to say thank you very much. And we hope to learn more from you in the future.
Great. Thank you.